Okay, so one of the factors that can undermine our notion of radical psychological freedom is the possibility that unconscious processes are influencing our decision making systems and our behavior. A nice example of some of this research is in the field of memory. And the concept is called implicit memory. Now, here's one definition, and different scholars have different definitions, but here's one. Influences of past experience on later performance in the absence of conscious memory for the earlier experience. And a nice example of this type of thing would be stereotype. Stereotypes form over long periods of time, and so the explicit conscious recollection for the learning episodes has faded, right? But the associations are still there and have the potential then to influence cognition and behavior. Now, how do you even study these implicit associations? Well, recently, using computer software, there's a technique called the implicit association test, and we'll see how that works. But this is widely used now to sort of get a grip on the architecture of our implicit representations. So let's take a look at and see how that might work. So back to our model, let's imagine you are in the habit of watching the evening news every night, right? So you're sitting down in front of your television and you see the TV screen, you hear the newscaster, you're sitting on your couch, right? So you're having a conscious experience and you're paying attention to the news stories that come your way. Your central executive is steering your attention towards what it is that you're seeing and hearing, and the contents of your working memory are filled with the news of the day. Now, the idea is, let's say you see on Monday night, you see a story about CEOs of large corporations, and the people on the news story, the CEOs, are males, right? You might not think anything about it, but that's the way the news story is presented. CEOs are shown as males. On Tuesday night, the story comes up on the local news, and there's been a crime in the neighborhood, and the perpetrator was an African American or another minority individual. And again, you don't necessarily think consciously anything about it, but that's the news story. On Wednesday, there's a story about some scientists at NASA or engineers, and who are they talking to? Males again. Again, you might not think anything about it, but that's the story. So the idea here is imagine just weeks and weeks of news viewing. You're paying attention to the stories. You're storing some of the information into long-term storage systems. Now, if it's Monday night, later Monday night, you might be able to remember what you saw in the news that night. If so, you would have stored an autobiographical memory. On Tuesday, you might still be able to remember Monday night's newscast, but maybe not. Certainly when you get to next month, you're going to have a difficult time remembering any particular news story that you saw on a particular day. So what's happening, it seems, that over time we're losing the autobiographical memory for each individual event. Remember, the autobiographical memories, these are the memories that include you, right, the me. So I was there. I remember what was happening, where I was. But what seems to go on here in these instances is that we forget the particular episodes of learning, right? However, what we learned in each news story can be stored in our other long-term systems. So here in this box here, declarative knowledge, facts about the world, the idea is that as we watch the news story, we are associating CEOs with being male, crime with minorities, scientists and engineers with being male, right? And those associations will be strengthened every time you see a news story about them, even if you forget the particular learning episodes of each nightly newscast. So, if it's the case that we forget all of the learning episodes, but we retain these associations, this would be a mechanism for understanding how stereotypes emerge in our neural networks. That our brains are registering, they're recording the associations that we see in the world, but we're forgetting the particular learning episodes. Now, you might say, well, what about the case where you see some kind of association on TV? You see the story about the CEOs and they're males, and you say, oh, see, you recognize it. Oh, that's the stereotype. Right? So you're conscious of the story and you are aware that it is stereotypical. CEOs are males. And maybe you feel that you want to resist this. You don't like this. Maybe you feel like the news stations should cover women CEOs, for example, right? So even if you object to the presentation of the stereotype, the question then would be, when you object, or if you object, does that affect the storage of the link itself? And we'll look at some research in this area. There is some evidence to suggest that even though you might object to the stereotype in the moment, right? So you disavow yourself of that stereotype. You recognize it as a stereotype, and you do not accept it. Even if you reject the stereotype in the moment, the associations in your implicit memory systems can be strengthened, right? And so stereotypes can remain implicitly, even though you explicitly reject the association. And this makes sense of some data we'll see later, why it is that people with all kinds of sort of egalitarian values, or people who express explicitly their principles of equality and so on, can yet still harbor implicit biases for their in-group or one group in society or another, or implicit biases that capture stereotypes that we might see in our culture.